Okay, and then I had already tweeted out the slides, and I'll have a link at the end. So I first wanted to start with thanking you, also the organizers, the people who invited me, everyone who's attending. Of course, I'm thrilled to be going first. So that, I guess, leaves me the opportunity to raise a lot of questions and talk about problems, and then not do anything about that. Because I think there are a whole bunch of wonderful talks coming after me where you'll see some of these things in practice. So you'll have a chance to benefit that as I set the bar reasonably low, and then you can all take it from there. What I want to talk about, some things that I'm involved with, and these ideas of training and teaching, technology, togetherness came to mind when somebody said, well, what are you going to talk about? So I said, I'll put something together. So I'll talk about it from the experience of working at Cold Spring Harbor, and also one of the projects I work on called Cyverse, and then also a little bit about software carpentry, which I think many in the audience might know about. So going back to Cold Spring Harbor, I've been there 15 years, and this is a photo of the first course at Cold Spring Harbor, so July 7th, 1890, which is a long time ago if you're American, not if you're European, I guess, and you have, courses that started in 600 something or whatever. But for us, that's a very long time ago to have anything happen in 1890. And at that course, I actually found the agenda for the course. So they were going to be working on microscopy and collecting samples. So it started actually as a field station to study the origin of life. And I like the part about it, about that students should bring microscopes if they're able to bring their own microscopes. If they don't, you can count on them to have one for you, but they'd like you to bring them. I just don't know if you appreciate how heavy a microscope of that time is. Barbara McClintock, or one of her microscopes, is in my office, and it's about like 45 or 50 pounds. I don't have photos of it myself because I don't think to take a photo of it, but people who visit sometimes don't talk to me, but actually people will come into my office and actually just take a photo of the microscope. So I found one on Twitter from a friend. That is about like 50 pounds of microscope. So that was something for those first people taking that course. Currently at Cold Spring Harbor, we have about 25 conferences every year, 20 small meetings, and 30 advanced courses. So we have actually a lot of visitors. It's a fairly small place if you haven't been there. But over the number of years, there's more than 15,000 people who've taken these courses. At Cold Spring Harbor's Learning Center, which is where I am, we focus on education and molecular biology, often for what we would say middle school students and high school students, so younger students than the postgraduate courses that we teach generally at the lab. We do a lot of faculty training, so I do quite a bit of that. Websites. We also have a number of centers internationally, so either that have been modeled on or we're collaborations with, or with Cold Spring Harbor, or licensed, like the one that we have currently in Suzhou, China. And we see about 30,000 students that come to us, and more than 2 million students really have been impacted by courses either that we've done or that people that we've collaborated done. And I was thinking, how has that education changed? If we're thinking about, this is the COSI education keynote, what's the difference between that 1890, I'm sorry, I'm going back in time further than even the country existed, but that 1890 course and the course today. I think, if you want to, even though this is more of a computational meeting, I think if you want to call yourself a biologist, you have to have some amount of credibility of having at least once looked in a microscope. Maybe some people at this meeting might not have done that, but it's a question. And one of the question is, why do data and computation present some special challenges? And I think that's a very valid question, because you could make the argument that nothing that we do is really any different than what other areas of biology need to worry about. And so why are there particular challenges? We always say that bioinformatics is new, and so maybe there's some difficulties with that. Is that actually the case? One thing, of course, that we know, we always talk about is, yes, there's more data. I know some of these things are small. That's why you can download the slides later. The left-hand side was a graphic from this paper I liked by Mike Schatz and others on the scale of genomic data. The one on the right you might recognize a little bit more, I do, from NCBI's Sequence Read Archive, that has 24 quadrillion base pairs of DNA. Yes, there's more data than, let's say, some other areas or subdisciplines of biology that a student might need to worry about. But I don't really have a good way to capture it, so I tried something that probably doesn't work, but just gives you an idea. It's kind of random. The multidisciplinarity and the complexity of our data, or what you have to think about as a student or as a computational biologist, actually is interesting. Don't know exactly how to put it, but I'll try one or two different ways. First, you have all of your sort of just basics of the complexities of worrying about biology, whether you're talking about genes or proteins or networks. But then there's the interface of what we as biologists need in order to execute on our experimental apparatus, whether that's the engineering skills that give us a particular type of sequencing chemistry or sequencing platform or whatever. But then there's also all of these interesting things, and I don't call them disciplines, I just call them forces, because market or tech or things like that, those aren't necessarily studying something for science's sake. They're trying to make money. But it's interesting that there's this unique sort of unseen force around a lot of the things that we do as computational biologists, where we benefit, in many cases, from improvements and innovations that come from somebody trying to make you buy something that you don't need on the internet or make you watch more movies, but yet those algorithms or those scalability of technologies is actually really relevant. We need to know about them. We also worry about them because they steal the students that you've worked really hard to train, and then they also will make people buy and click things that they don't need to do. But there's really a lot of stuff that could, in some cases, be peripheral, but maybe some cases more direct, that you have to think about that influence the environment in which we're trying to educate our students, or think about what do they need to know out of all of these possible levels. Are there things that they must pay attention to or things that they could ignore? If we think more specifically about biology, and just looking at the last couple of decades and thinking about, as a biologist, what technologies would you have seen or needed to be familiar with? It's sort of linear, right? Even now, I mean, we could put down single cell, of course, as a part of RNA-seq, but it's a sort of linear path of molecular tools, right? I have not really been in the lab very seriously for a while now, but if I needed to do a CRISPR experiment, I probably could get something halfway working in a week or so. If there's an Vitrogen kit, then even half the time. But if you think about the computational things that you needed to change and to update yourself, there's a really big skill gap, and the spread is really so broad that there are really a lot of choices that you need to make in order to figure out what's relevant for you and for your students. And I did take out a slide. Maybe I should have left it back in, but for those of you who remember the 2x2 matrix that one business school put out about things you need to learn, and it said, well, statistics, you don't need that, and those are important. So you don't know what you don't know, but it's really hard. What are the decisions about what people need to know about that? This meeting is pretty computational, pretty sophisticated. But if you go ahead and just put the word machine learning in front of anything you're talking about, people will show up because they're scared. Is this something that I need to know? Is it something that's going to change what I'm doing, et cetera? So there are definitely some educational challenges. I'm going to mention a few, and like I said, I'll raise a lot more questions than I'll answer, because the wonderful talk's coming after me, and you can ask those people what they think. So one group that I'm involved with is this group called Nibbles. It's great to do this here outside the US because there's often not communication. So this is an RCN, a Research Collaboration Network funded by NSF. It stands for the Network for Integrating Bioinformatics into Life Science Education. I should also mention, I guess you can Google them, because we are having a meeting in October. That's our next meeting, so people could register and think about visiting us. It will be in Omaha. And I asked them to make sure that there's no tornadoes. The last time we went, as we were leaving, there were funnel clouds coming down, and we had to end a little bit early, but maybe not this time. This is a group that is interested in understanding what are some of the barriers and also what are some possible approaches to helping integrate bioinformatics. And we actually like the name Nibbles because we want people to just take small bites of bioinformatics. it's usually the faculty who are most scared of bringing this in the classroom, but how can we prepare them? So we did a survey that was just mentioned in the introduction, and we're redoing the survey. We know better questions to ask now, but we got a decent number of responses that allow us to understand what are some barriers to integrating bioinformatics, and then also what do you actually teach. There was one paper that was out already with some competencies that we think might be interesting to look at for undergraduate bioinformatics. If we look, we got pretty good coverage of many demographics, but not as well as we'd want for underrepresented groups. But we are going to back and do some of that information, get some of that information with the 2.0 version of the survey. One of the things we found is that 95% of faculty say yes, we think bioinformatics really needs to be a key part of the undergraduate curriculum, but actually very few faculty still do it. And of course, we're concerned with how do we change that. The biggest need for all of these groups, when you look at it, is really training. So most of the faculty who are not able to do this integration, they say that they don't have the expertise and the training that they need in order to bring it in, which is a completely reasonable barrier and one that we have to work hard to do. And there are some other difficulties that I'm not going to go into in this particular talk, but it also varies by institution type. Some institutions aren't trying at all because they figure it's not their focus, and so they don't see it as relevant to them. Of course, we disagree personally because we're like, everybody should be doing it. Some cases, maybe that is the right choice for the particular scope that they're doing, but we want to find some way at some level because we think every student can benefit from some level of computational training. And as we're having a discussion this morning, as a biologist, if you're educating students, I think it's a little bit of a disservice to educate someone who could only possibly be a biologist when they're done. I think that the idea that we have the opportunity to educate students who could also graduate saying, I'm also a data scientist and I also have these other skills, that's really, really where I think we're going with that. We also saw that in terms of the barriers, for those respondents who were underrepresented minorities, they face those barriers more often. One thing that's hard to interpret, because it's a complicated graph, but this is basically a PCA for categorical data. The only thing you could pay attention to is these sort of colors of these groups. So in the US, we have these associates institutions with 2-year colleges essentially, and they're a really distinct group from all of the other groups. So these are the sort of PhD granting institutions over here. These are the undergraduate-only institutions. Someone who does a master's is somewhere in the middle. But they really stratify really nicely in terms of a whole bunch of behaviors, whether their faculty are formally trained or not. It's too complex to go into. All you need to just maybe take away for a moment is that there are these distinct groups of faculty sometimes, depending on how you look at it. And one of the interesting findings of that paper was that we thought that if you were getting your degree as a faculty member later along the spectrum of when we surveyed, so if you more recently graduated, you probably would have more exposure or more training in bioinformatics, and that's true, that faculty who got their terminal degree in 2010 to 2016, almost half of them had some formal bioinformatics training, but they were actually the least likely to bring it into the classroom. And we don't know why yet. So we don't know. They're at all the different institution types at about the same rate. There weren't a lot of other differences that we could find out, so we're trying to figure out. We think part of it, there's certainly a disincentive. You're disincentivized as a new faculty member, although you're hired because we want you to bring this to us. But then, of course, you need to think about your evaluations. If you're going to try something new, there's a risk for doing that. So how do we mitigate those risks? So we want to ask more questions there. But that group, which here now is in purple, is a different group. The faculty members that are more recently graduated are, even though they're better trained, they're less likely to bring that into the classroom. These skill gaps that we see just in the classroom aren't limited to undergraduate education. So one other project that I work on, I'm not, ironically, I guess, going to talk about anything in terms of the technology of that particular project. But one project that I work on, Cybers, is a project that's concerned with bringing some of these data skills and technologies. I'm not going to say a lot about it, But one of the things that we wanted to do is understand some of the needs of our users and what are the things that they come to us with, because obviously we need to design platforms and systems that they can use. I'll be talking about this in other talks, so you could find more information about that elsewhere. But we know from users, not in fact just our own users, but just going and doing surveys at lots of workshops and courses and things like that, that most biologists are working with really large data sets where they do need to have a fairly sophisticated set of skills in order to be able to do the types of analyses that they want. So we've been doing that type of survey or that type of analysis for a number of years. And what we find out when we ask them about their own personal levels of bioinformatics skills is actually that most of them feel that they really don't have a very high level of skill, so that's okay. Asking people what they think they do and what they actually can do is two different things. But just in general, there's not a high degree of penetrance. And this particular group, again, being at a computational meeting is a little bit weird. We always sort of speak within our own bubble, but it's hard to realize that even though we're struggling with, how do we improve some performance of a support vector machine or whatever else we're working on, whereas other people really have never touched more than one button on a blast search and adjusted a parameter or thought about a database. So there really are distinct groups within our discipline of biologists in terms of their treatment and their thinking about some sophisticated things when it comes to bioinformatics. So we wanted to ask those questions, and we did a survey of not just faculty, but really researchers. Some may have teaching responsibilities, some may not, just to try to understand what were the needs. So this is, these are awardees, so people who have a grant, investigators, funded by NSF Bio, so National Science Foundation in the US, and there's 4 directorates within Bio, and we asked them all, what are some of the current and pressing and future needs? And the most important takeaway from that was really that the most important needs for all of those faculty were training. The top 3 of these 13 or so unmet needs were types of training on integration. So data integration is really a key area, I think, for us all, because a lot of the technologies, like let's say RNA-seq, single cell is still Wild West, but a lot of the basic RNA-seq things that you do, they're fairly cheap, right? And they're fairly straightforward to get some decent data from a number of things. And if we think about sequencing technologies that we're able to generate these data really, really quickly, but now that you can generate large, complex, rich data sets for low cost, and you can do multiples of those, the question is, how do I put those things together? And then if I am pressing against the edge in what I can do in terms of acquisition of phenotypes or understanding that, how do I take those data and integrate? So it's a key challenge, and faculty members feel they don't have training for that. The next thing is a training on data management and metadata. That topic has already come up at this meeting and will continue to come up. We're not done yet with the meeting. That is an important task. And then also training on scaling to the cloud. And that's nice. I mean, it means that some of the more basic things, like how to write a simple script, not that that isn't a need, but different things like carpentries and like better migration of these topics into the curriculum are addressing that. But these more sophisticated needs are things that people are worried about. I think it's positive because it means that faculty members are hitting up against a higher barrier than might have been 5 years ago. But it definitely is a case because usually training is really underfunded. There's another paper that's cited in this one, and I think it was a Canadian, one of the Canadian computing services. It was like a society. And they asked people, what do you think are your most important needs? And they got similar answers a number of years ago. But then they asked, well, what are the actual levels of funding for all of those needs? And training is somewhere like 6th or 7th compared to buy more hardware. And I think it's really easy as a funder to count how many CPUs you've purchased and how big the disk is that you own. But it's very, very difficult to estimate, did somebody who attended your training actually get something out of it, and can they do things to the level of expertise and skill that you think, which leads to this paper, which many of you saw about the training and boot camps and workshops. So this is Felton et al., also fairly, 1 or 2 years old. But this idea of studying PhD students, and this was really, really not a survey at the end of the day and like, what'd you think about this? But they did everything from capturing all of the abstracts that these students wrote over the course of their studies. They really, really measured in every way that they could the scientific output of students to try to figure out, did students who went through initial sort of intensive boot camp experience to sort of bring them up to speed at the beginning of their PhD with whatever sort of computational skill they thought that they would need. And they find
this is specific for bioinformatics?
This was, most of that short format training was specifically bioinformatics. That was the need that they, it sounds like a reasonable thing to do, right? We're bringing in a new class of graduate students. Let's put them through something for a week so that they could learn how to turn on a computer. But in the end, they found it was really hard to capture any difference between those students who took those courses or not. And there are some ways, I'm not going to go into it in this particular talk, there are some ways that groups are trying to address it, but it's a really big thing because we do spend a lot of money on this. And the other thing is, although I'm not showing it here, people leave the boot camp or leave the training feel very good. That it was positive, and I'm so glad I exposed that. But they actually, and this is not a new result, they actually also feel very intimidated because they realize, wow, I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and now what do I need to do about that? And we found in the Nibbles survey data that the group of faculty that did the worst in terms of integration and was the faculty that they only relied on boot camps and workshops for their training. They felt worse about their preparation. And that's not inconsistent with something that would that you'd get from educational pedagogy. So I think there will be a talk later on the bioinformatics mastery rubric. You should listen to that one. But some of these things wouldn't be surprising for somebody who comes from the educational psychology background. They were surprising to me when I first looked at them because I'm like, whoa. But that doesn't mean that workshops and boot camps can't work. They can. They just can't be thrown out there by anybody. In fact, I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the idea, and you've seen it happen, that you're really, really good at scikit-learn. Why don't you teach everybody about that? Who is that person that you're putting in front of them? Are they really a competent teacher? They may know exactly what they're doing, but they may not be the best teacher of those materials, and that's what happens often. So I'll get to that in a second. One thing I'm going to talk very little about, because we're moving along in time here, but I had another T in my talk, which is technology, right? And how technology helps address these changes. One trend to think about, just thinking about it from a different point, is in some of the other sciences, the trend is very different than biology. So in physics and astronomy, of course, we hear Large Hadron Collider down the road compared to my normal distance from it. Or in astronomy, as they continue to build some of these large array telescopes, their big data is increasingly centralized around, literally this is our apparatus, this is our machine. And biology, a couple of years ago on the left-hand side, people put up maps of where is there one of these high-throughput sequencing machines, or next-generation sequencing was back. I could use that term again because that's what it was called. You don't have a map like this anymore, right? About who has a nanopore. Some of you may have one in your pocket right now, right? So actually, in biology, it's been a reversal of that trend, where it's not about what university has their own sequencing facility. It's everybody has their sequencing facility. And so as biological big data becomes less associated with that shared physical infrastructure, it changes things in a little bit of a way that I just wanted to point out. Part of the other reason why it's changing is because we have a technology stack, and I just threw up random things. I'm sorry if your favorite thing is missing from there. But if you think about it, all of the technologies that we have, although very few things that I just sort of threw up here were purpose-built for some problem that biologists in particular had, all of these technologies really in themselves are enablers for individuals or very small groups or very, sort of custom, I don't want to use, but I could use the word boutique communities that have something they're working on that they really can marshal resources to do what they need to do. So I just have one slide about technology. Technology X, I don't know what X is for you, but it's whatever you want it to be, especially if you forgot your favorite. But all of the technologies that we tend to be gravitating around, I think, and using are technologies that help democratize access to compute at any scale. In fact, let me just start off by saying everything on this slide, any one individual may not be able to do it. That's okay. But in general, all of us now have a tremendous capacity to say, you know what, if I want to work on the cloud, if I want to work on HPC, everybody in this room at least knows what button they need to push or who they need to talk to get them access to that. And that wasn't true 10 years ago, right, that you could work at any scale that easily. The dependencies and choices of environment, if you're talking about containerization, all of these things that were really difficult 10 years ago that people really banged their head against, a lot of them are actually solved. Like there's really a lot of interesting science that is not engineering going on. Also, I like these last two, this idea of we're really able to let those individual groups or communities organize and share data, whether it's locally, just within their own group. The practices exist. Individual investigators may not themselves know about them or be the best users of them yet. They need more help. But that's possible. And even the decision on control of your publication framework. So things like preprints, and those are game changers because it basically means, if an individual wants to use all of the tools of open science and just do things, they can do it to some extent. There's all these other political structures that might rest on top, that might put weight. That's not completely fair on things sometimes, but in principle, a lot of these things are done. So it's still complex, and I like this quote, which of course, if you search for it, it will be attributed to Einstein, which is incorrect, although there's like 20,000 Einstein quotes that aren't Einstein quotes, but it's actually this guy, Leo Cherney, he's a computer scientist. Computers are incredibly fast, accurate, and stupid. Man is unbelievably slow and accurate and brilliant, and we want to combine them effectively. So the question I had was, how do we tune into the slow, inaccurate brilliance of persons? How do we capture that? And so the message that I'm, and I think other people agree to, is that our brains haven't changed since that original slide in the 1980s, and you just needed to know how to clone a gene, and that was basically it. You're done. You're set for your assistant professorship is guaranteed somewhere. To 2019, where it's something may happen this afternoon that you sit in a talk and you realize, wow, I really need to brush up on something I didn't know about because this is really going to enable me to do something. So how do we actually go about doing that? And I think, again, what we're aiming for is actually what this room is all about, and which many of these people in this room are actually doing. So it had no credit and no relationship to me, but it's this idea of community of practice. So here's a definition that I like. Communities of practice, it sounds fairly simple, but then sometimes important things are simple, are just groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward definition. It may not seem mind-blowing, but what I want to emphasize or what I want to pull out is that we cannot ignore the work that everybody in this room is already doing to make these communities of practice happen. Sometimes what happens in life, I think, is that things don't have a name, and so it's going on and it's existing, but unless you start calling it out, then you don't realize, okay, wait a second, that's right, we're already doing that. What is that thing? Where did it come from? Jean Lave is a cultural anthropologist, 1991, and others came up with these definitions. This one is a little bit longer, but I do like this idea of being able to develop an identity as a member of a community and becoming knowledgeably skillful are part of the same process. The message, which I will distill later, but let me try to distill it ahead of time, is that I think one of the solutions for training and teaching and education is helping individuals, whoever they are, wherever they are, to actually find out who are the other similar individuals who are solving similar challenges. And if we get individual people to realize that we're all on the same career trajectory or learning trajectory for a particular problem set or a particular area of science, then maybe we all need to teach that group the same set of things, or we need to all make sure that this group is not missing out on a technology they need to know. How do we actually develop this idea of community practices, a community of practice to a more sophisticated level? I put a reference there, an idea, and writing on this more thoroughly that was selected as a finalist by NSF. We'll see if they actually select it as really one of their big ideas for 2026. But just 3 bullets that I pulled out of it is, what success would look like to me. This is just my personal opinion from the output of what groups like this one are doing, is that whoever the STEM professional is, and I group in that not just researchers but also educators, because they're in the classroom making the next generation of our STEM researchers, they need to be able to clearly identify with the community of practice. I don't know exactly what level that will be. It'll probably be more than just saying I'm an associate professor at this university. But if you say I'm an associate professor and I'm working on this particular organism or this particular system, what are other people who are doing the same thing? Not only what papers are they publishing, but actually what did they learn and how did they get to that path? And how can we enhance that? Also, what are the ways that an individual community practice, you could think of them also as a stakeholder group from our perspective as trainers or teachers. How do they identify relevant skills and information? So in other words, can we make that decision so that individuals who may not know what they may not know, but if we actually say as a group, you know what, you didn't think you needed to know this particular subject, but I'm telling you, this group of people needs to know about this subject. Now the thought, some sophisticated group knows, okay, well, my peers have reached a consensus that we actually need to brush up on, our Gaussian processes and understanding of those. Okay, great, let's do that. How do we get them to identify? And then finally, how do we take all the knowledge that they develop and all of those training materials and make sure that they are, function in some kind of way? And I use the commons as an analogy for that. I think one of the next talks on making training fair is going to talk about how do we make those materials accessible. One personal attempt to do a little bit of this, which was at the level of my effort, which is not very much because I'm scattered, but I put up this website of lifesciencetrainers.org. It actually started as a Slack channel. I was in a meeting not paying attention, and the meeting was on education and this sort of stuff. But then I thought, you know what? It doesn't take any money or effort to put on a Slack channel and to tweet about it. And within like a week, we had 100 members sign up, and there's 200 something people there. More interesting, it says there's 9,000, the analytics from it says 9,000 messages exchanged. So I hope some of those are people never met before, never talked before, asking a question like, hey, I saw that you're teaching this. How could I teach that too? Basically, it's fulfilling this idea of community of practice, right? That if we could make it easier for people to identify who are their peers and be able to share, at some level, lots of levels, that's already happening in really nice ways. There's people here from Goblet, people here from H3, there's from so many different organizations, which I'm not going to talk about because I'll mischaracterize it. But however many ways that we can make it possible for people to come together and do things like that is really important. But rather than me talk about that immature effort, which is still development, a really great way to talk about a community practice is actually to look at a functioning one and see what they're doing and how they're doing. In my opinion, which is biased because I was a chair of the Software Carpentry Foundation at one point, and then also still I'm an instructor. I think the Carpentries have done a really fantastic job of this, and there's really nothing like it. So for those people who may not be familiar, how many people have never heard of the Carpentries? Okay. Okay, there's a few people in the room. So talk to somebody who didn't raise their hand, which is basically everyone else. But basically, I always describe it not in any of these ways because I'm not as fancy. I always say it's scientists teaching scientists how to code because I think that's sounds like something that people donate money to, which you need to. But it's essentially groups. It's essentially really a community of practice. I'll get to that slide in a second. But before I do, I'll mention that they've done basically every week somewhere on Earth, a Carpentries workshop is happening. And they've done it in all 7 continents, 46 countries. They have more than 1,000 instructors. I think this is really, really important because I don't know about you, but for every time we try to get money and get funding for training or for doing anything, the question that the funder comes back is, well, how will it be sustained and how can it go? Because they're used to funding things, and they also create the environment for funding things for a few years, and then they stop funding it, and then it goes away, and then they ask what happened. Well, anybody who would fund this would never have to ask what happened because actually it's already sustainable. There's a lot more that they could do, but it's already doing pretty well. And this message of togetherness, or this message of what the Carpentries does, that some of the characteristics of that, is that they've really worked very, very hard to think about inclusivity and accessibility for all of their learners. And because it's really the amalgamation of lots of individuals giving a little bit of effort, they do things that none of us would be able to do. So translating the lessons into multiple languages, which is happening, but also thinking about how do we develop accessibility of our lessons for individuals in the blind community or with other sort of accessibility issues that we want to address. The idea of the opportunities to fail when learning. So creating a mechanism where it's really a community that you know people, you know your colleagues, and you have an idea that you're coming at this at the same level regardless of whatever your position is outside the Carpentries. The idea of lifelong learning is something that's really, really important for any community of practice because as long as you're working, you want to be working towards acquiring this information. And this idea of both a mix of virtual and in-person. Of course, in-person is always expensive, but everybody, I think, knows there's no real substitute for being able to do things in person. And collaboration, where everything is open, the code, the data. So I'm not going to talk more than that about the Carpentries other than to say that that's a really pristine example of what a community practice is capable of. Because if you talk to people who are involved in the Carpentries, and there are many of them here, you'll really find that they're enthusiastic about sharing what they know and making those things available for other people. So it's really a platform for the dissemination of that knowledge. So some take-home messages, winding it down, and there'll be time for a couple of questions and discussion on anything, but I promised that I wouldn't be going over time, and I'm done very well on time, actually. Some questions that I hope people think about as they look at the next set of talks that go on. How does what is being presented work within a community, and maybe even your community? So I think the speakers will probably be telling you how it works within the communities that they've established, but how could this work for you, or how could you make it work for you is a really important thing. And then also, how are you creating opportunities for what you learn to be shared with your peers? So intrinsically, it may be that you say, well, I'm a trainer, and so I do train people on a particular thing. But I mean your peers. So as a trainer, how are you interacting with people in this room and making sure that you're sharing what you know? Or are there things that need to be shared that we're not doing effectively as we could? One more quote from Lave. To think diversely about what communities of practice mean. So if you download the slides, you'll find the reference in very small font. But you need to read that particular paragraph. It's cool. It talks about forms of apprenticeship. This is familiar to anybody who's gotten a graduate degree, which involves exploitation of apprentices as sources of free or cheap labor. So that can happen too. The cool thing about that paper was that a community of practice doesn't have to be based on a traditional apprenticeship model. So the apprenticeship model could be anything from the university model, where exploited in some ways, to also sort of if you watch something like Chopped or any of the chef-based reality shows where people are being yelled at, and your idea is you have to go through a really harsh process before you graduate to whatever level of expertise. But actually, there are other cultures who have apprenticeship models which are apparently less exploitive and which actually come up with a more fair result. So you should look at this because this person's are anthropologists, so they have a little bit more objectivity there in coming to some result. So my last message then really is that technology is going to scale without your help because it's happening around us. We almost have to do nothing in this room to worry about those technological difficulties. Yes, we worry about them at the start of the workshop. We worry about them when we realize there's a new technology that we haven't adapted. But basically, that's happening in spite of us. The thing that I think people who are concerned about education are most need to focus on is actually how do we grow individual people. And it's that people element, which I hope has been all throughout the talk as the most important thing, because all of those other sort of layers can take care of themselves. But if we focus on growing individual people and thinking about them, the word community is not just some sort of soft and fuzzy word. It's really the way all of our transactions happen. And so rather than ignoring that, we really should seek to understand that better and figure out how we can enhance that. So I didn't take all of my time. There's time for questions. There's time for my selfish plug on a workshop that we're doing in Rome, so come visit us in October. I wanted to do a series of workshops that focused on people who are not ordinarily reached with training. So we were thinking about reaching people who, I use the term decision makers. Like, let's say your PI is never going to do that actual pipeline that she's asking you to build, but she needs to know something about how it works, or that layer of people who don't necessarily do the day-to-day coding. So we're doing a workshop, and it's moving in that direction, and we'd love your comments or your participation. You can download the slides there, and since we have a little time, happy to take questions, and also if people have comments or things that they just want to say, well, since I do have a few moments, you can even give one of those comment questions that you're not supposed to give, but I'm happy to hear it while I'm here. So thank you once again to everybody, and with that, I'll leave it to the audience.
We have plenty of time for questions, but if you have one, please use the microphone.
They'll be recorded, yeah.
Jason, thank you for your wonderful talk. I will put up my Goblet hat now. So
Okay.
I'm in the board of Goblet, and especially the communities of practice. I think this is a great initiative. We've, of course, also joined your first meeting. And I was thinking going forward, Goblet is, the most of our members are like on the organizational level, where we have organizations like ISCB, like EBI, and so on. And although we have individual memberships, where we have, I think, also some people that might also be in your community, I have the feeling that we need to bring the two together.
I'd love to, yeah, I think.
And I was wondering if you have a little discussion about how we could make this happen,
Sure.
and how we could have a formal collaboration, put that in place.
Yeah, so the most important thing for me about that effort of this life science trainer thing, which I, at least whatever effort I have to put into things, it's actually been posting people's biographies. The idea that there are people out there like me that spend a lot of time just going out to universities or places and training and teaching, but you don't know who they are, and they may not have a face, or maybe this is going to be their career. Promoting individual people seemed to me really, really important. I think that this happened with this idea recently of research software engineers, that all of a sudden, again, something that didn't exist but was always there, and then you give it a name, and then you realize that people have a badge that they can put on now. It's like, oh, that's right, I belong to something, I be something. So we should definitely move that up and get a way to combine those efforts for sure.
Yeah, good. Let's try that. Also on Goblet, we are working on a list of trainers, and people can also get the visibility here, which I think we share this idea about that people also, they want to find others,
Yes.
but they also want to be found themselves with the credits and their work, in this case, related to the training.
Yeah. One of the deficits in the U.S., I think, is that if we look at a system like Elixir, like Goblet, which is done very well in Europe, and also a little bit in Canada, that it's there, and the U.S. has just never, in my personal feeling, organized itself in exactly that way. You either belong in the NSF camp or the NIH camp, and maybe you care about this, and that hasn't come together to me as much as it could. I think there's a lot of potential. So,
and this brings me to the detailed question then. From the people in your channel, are they then mostly US based, or is this like globally?
I think there's a fair amount of US, but I think if I remember, it was from 16 different countries. So there's a spread. Since we had our call was in multiple time zones, so there's still a spread, but it's still growing. I have not really forced the organization yet. We have several volunteers, and we're looking for a few more, but I want the gender balance to be right before we form a steering committee, so I'm hoping to see more of that.
Thanks. So let's try to join forces.
Yeah, we'll talk more.
Thanks.
I'm here. There's another couple of questions.
Yeah, hi. This is very tall.
Yes.
I am not very tall. Okay. So really fantastic talk, and you talked about a couple of really great examples of forming a community practice among educators. Do you have examples of really effective models for helping our students form effective communities of practice with each other, especially as they move from exposure and understanding of concepts to actually applying it to their own data?
So actually, if I just talk about from the bioinformatics perspective, I think actually the forthcoming talk on the learning trajectories and the bioinformatics mastery rubric is a potential way of helping students, whether you think about, I mean, it might have been, it really was written a little bit for, let's say, older students, graduate students, something like that, but at whatever level of student, let's just focus on undergraduate. Helping students to understand, I think, is tremendously important where they are at and who they belong with, and what trajectory. Are you going to be a doctor? Are you going down a data science route? Are you going down something like that? Since the students, on top of everything else they have to learn, don't know that until they're told that, I think then the aim might be to convince faculty, here is a really nice trajectory of things for your students to do. Here's how you help students assess where they are at, and then give them the tools to sort of self-identify as, okay, you know what, here's how I can find other people who are learning in this way. I don't know if also through, for example, ISCB, if students already very computationally inclined and they want to become this, you know, do you have the mechanism for them to say, oh, you know, join the society and really think about how you do? I think that's an example of a community practice that's directed at students. So it doesn't have to be very formal if you read the paper, but I agree that I think in the future, or this is my personal future that I'm creating, and which may not exist outside of my own head, but being able for people to self-identify with others who are going on that same route, the faster that you can make that process happen, I think is tremendously important, because you need to both insulate those students from the outside world of things that they don't need to pay attention to, and then reinforce the things that they need to learn within that little group by saying, okay, the group decision is we need to go in this direction. So maybe seeing that happen, it's a hypothesis to test. There was another question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for a really fascinating presentation. I have a kind of general question, and that is whether you feel that the area of computational bioinformatics, whether there's something sort of special about it in terms of training. Over the last few decades, there have been sort of waves of innovation, and a few decades ago, it was, say, molecular biology or molecular genetics, and those have sort of been subsumed into a larger, area of biological science. And do you think that the same thing will happen with computational biology and bioinformatics, or do you think that the skills that people need are just kind of different, and it'll always be it's almost like a specialist kind of practice?
I'm not like totally convinced, but I do think that there is something that's a little bit special going on with the computational, with any area of computational biology, because it doesn't belong. A lot of the things that we care about don't belong to us. The term data science came from industry and came from tech. It didn't come from academia. Now everybody's relabeling their things as being data science because they say, well, it always was that, and I can get better funding if I call it that. But things that we care about come from outside of, advances in the field come from outside of where we are at. In some ways, I think there are some peculiarities that make it different in the training that we have to deliver to students. It seems at least more infinite than the level of skills that we have to learn from just molecular biology, where we're linearly acquiring those skills. But in tech, it may really be that because tech is so broad and you may not know what you need at the beginning, that if we move in the direction of better defining, no, actually here's just the subset of skills that you need to focus on, then it could be really tractable. Like, okay, everybody needs to learn basic Linux, but you know what, you don't have to learn machine learning at all because you are going in this direction. So I wonder if everyone's still trying to figure out where the ground will settle and then can more precisely define what the curriculum should be for those areas, then it becomes not as difficult. The other thing is, in terms of education, is I think one of the problems is that people who have a great deal of computational expertise often are called upon to teach that computational expertise, but with no teaching background of themselves. And so there's a lot of gaps in communications, and there's a lot of ineffective. I've been to so many tutorials and lessons where I'm like, wow, I'm never going to return to this again. And I've seen people taught things that I'm saying, wow, if that was my first time being taught that, I would never want to learn it. So I think that there's a lot of more work to regularize the educational experience, but there probably are some things that might end up being unique, but it just shouldn't be impossible. It's just, we'll have to see. We got a little time. That's my personal opinion, could be wrong.
Hi, thank you for the talk. In recent years, I was involved in Israel in various forms of educating physicians and clinicians, including, we put last year an edX course on this, and I didn't notice within all of your massive data about the immersion of bioinformatics into medical schools and stuff like that. Could you comment on this?
One quote that sometimes, so what we have, I have examples of the comments that faculty gave as to why they were having trouble introducing bioinformatics into the curriculum. And one exact quote that I remember was a faculty member who said that the reason why we don't introduce bioinformatics into our school is the hegemonic control of our curriculum by the medical school, because they don't see it as important. In some cases. And that's not the truth from every medical school. I know that you're making sure that your MD, PhD students learn a little bit about statistics, but with precision medicine and all of the sequencing initiatives, it's going to become more important, not less important, for physicians to have some idea of what a clinically significant variant might mean. So some of those things will seep in, but I think one of the responsibilities, again, of us, and I'll come back to the name Nibbles, is to figure out what's the minimum subset that you really actually need. So I think a lot of our work, going back even to the previous question, is trying to figure out, rather than pour and open a fire hose of information on everyone that we want to teach, how can we become better at really knowing precisely, here is what you need to know given what your goals are. And if we make that more precise, then maybe we have a better chance of not overwhelming people, because our brains are not going to get bigger unless maybe CRISPR. But until that moment, right, we're going to have to make selections. And so maybe this group has a responsibility of trying to filter and curate that information more precisely, so that when I say, oh, you need computational skills, that may not be effective. I need to say, you need these 3 computational skills, may actually be where we need to go. We have a few more moments.
Thanks, Jason, for a great talk. My name, I'm Radhika, you know me.
Everyone knows you, Radhika.
I had a question about what you just said a few minutes ago about, experts being called in to teach something when they may not know how to teach. These experts are being called in to teach because they have a ton of publications. They are recognized in the field as experts because of these publications.
Yeah.
Whereas people who are teaching or spending a lot of time on teaching will have fewer publications because teaching does not have citations, does not have publications or citations or DOIs or anything.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on?
I'll again sing the praises of the mastery rubric, not that it's going to solve all our problems, but I was talking with Rochelle, who's one of the authors of it, and I was thinking, one of the things that a community practice does is a community practice tries to say, well, what are our standards? What do we try to do? Yeah. So one vision I had for the group that I'm trying to sort of start with, and which other groups in here have already thought about, was what would be the case if you saw, let's say, if we think about the Elixir training portal, that there was a badge on a course saying that this course follows a rubric, or this course has gone through, it's been reviewed, right? If we can develop the mechanism within our own community, one message that's not a part of this particular talk, But for me, even though it's the Felden paper makes you say, well, should we be doing workshops at all? One of my messages is that for the foreseeable future, everybody in biology is going to rely on some type of short format training, whether it's workshops or boot camps or whatever. You need that because there's no way you're going to get it in undergraduate or graduate school. So everybody at some point in their career is going to say, hey, I need 2 days, or I need a week, or I need 3 weeks to be able to get to this level. What if you could know people who have really actual expertise in education and training have taken a course that was developed by domain experts in that course, but reviewed it and said, you know what, this course has learning objectives that have been properly positioned, this course has assessments, in the mastery rubric they talk about performance level descriptors. You're actually demonstrating in this course that I can successfully do X or Y or Z. So this group could potentially, and I don't mean just my life science, everyone in this room could potentially contribute to saying, we want to have a standard for our instruction. When people take an ISCB sponsored or a Elixir sponsored training course, that we know it's been reviewed, we know it meets certain standards, and you actually have an opportunity, you have a chance of learning in this course versus I show up for a workshop and I showed up for very expensive workshops. Thankfully, I wasn't paying for them, where it's like, wow, I just sat through 2 days of something I could have gotten up there and taught myself. And it was horrible because the person just didn't know how to teach. They were brilliant about their domain. So developing our own standards might be great.
Jason, as somebody who's had a lot of exposure to teaching communities like you have, what suggestions do you have to somebody who's thinking about joining a community as a trainer? Because given there's so many options, the Carpentries in the U.S., there's Black Girls That Code, and what are your thoughts on that?
I think everybody should become a Carpentries instructor, and we can do a training outside if we've got I think it's 8 hours now or something like that. I think the Carpentries is a really fantastic model. I fully would endorse the community as one that's really welcoming, inclusive. People have to decide that for themselves. One of the this kind of also goes to Radhika's question a little bit too. Oftentimes there aren't rewards for being a trainer, or it's not recognized, or maybe it's written that you have to do that, but there's no sort of follow-up to that. So I think one has to think about their own career too. And it just so happens that being a Carpentries instructor was absolutely fine with my career path and the expectations that my institution has for me. So finding out how to make that work for you is important, and then testing the waters to see if the community is really welcoming and inclusive is important, and then finding ways not to sell yourself short. I think everybody should be promoted and be able to have a voice and recognize for what they do, because often that doesn't happen, and you see people who are doing wonderful training work, but nobody knows, and there's no citations, there's no publications, there's no invitation to do a talk about it. It just sort of sits there in midair. It could be fantastic, but we don't share it as well. So hopefully that helps. Could talk more later. A couple more questions, and we've got like 3 minutes or something, and then we'll not lose.
Kath Brooksbank from the EBI, and David has very kindly allowed me to butt in because
Okay.
and Fergus.
She's like, this one's really important.
because I have a comment to the previous question.
Yes.
Actually, and thank you for a really inspirational talk. You've touched on many topics that are dear to the bioinformatics training community's heart, and one of the things that we addressed at a wonderful summit meeting that Nikki organised in Cape Town a few weeks ago is this idea of putting together some instruction for teachers and trainers to really get the most out of their training, and to emphasise the importance of structuring this properly so that people know what they're going to learn and their expectations are met and upheld.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And there are lots of other things.
That's
as well
fantastically important because, again, many times people show up to a training or show up to something and they can't make that decision for themselves because they may not know enough about what they're there to learn. So I think there was a blog post on on the website, the Life Science Trainers, I interviewed Rochelle Trachtenberg, who is the author of that other paper, and I asked her that question about how do you make those things more precise so that people can find out. But let me just say that if I'm converging on an idea, I think lots of people are converging on an idea, and I think we have the people in this room, and you know, this might be 90% of the people on Earth that do this kind of stuff. Maybe not 90, but I think we're like at 75. We're like pretty high on the level of people. So if we really do have this sort of critical mass, then yeah, we should be looking for ways to try to put that together, minimize any kind of redundancy, and really just sort of say, this is a critical thing, because every other subdiscipline of biology is increasingly, going back to the other comments, relying upon computational skills and relying on software that needs to be used appropriately and understood. And that knowledge is not going to be given to you at your undergraduate level. Hopefully your thesis is on it, because otherwise in that, then you have to struggle to get that information when it's available, where it's available, and it shouldn't be a dice roll of you showing up to a course and hopefully that's the course that gets you what you need. It should be ways that we give you clear paths. We have ways for people who are doing the training to sort of say, we have standards that go beyond a single institution or a single group. So I think we just keep talking about this, and we're getting closer. I mean, I read more about the Cape Town meeting and stuff. We're always getting closer. So technology, again, Slack and Twitter and all those things are connecting us and bringing us into that.
And we can actually do tomorrow as well. So I hope many of you will come along to the web session tomorrow, and you can contribute to that effort and others.
And I think we're at time now. You're gonna.
Yes. Maybe get you afterwards.
Maybe one.
Okay, one last question.
Oh, we do have
Yes,
time.
you go.
Right, I'll try to keep this brief. Although that talk, as the guy who usually gets roped into teaching things like scikit-learn because I happen to know them better than the other
There we
people
go.
around, that hit very hard.
I was trying to disguise and keep you anonymous, but sorry.
Try to do my best. So in this era of interdisciplinary science, and especially in the life sciences where you have all sorts of different technologies and you have people coming in from different fields, and in this era where the funding bodies want you to show that you're doing interdisciplinary training and you're actively seeking people from all sorts of backgrounds, this seems to exacerbate the boot camp problem of like postgraduate training courses where you do 1 week of coding, 1 week of statistics, 1 week of chemistry, whatever. One of the things that I've noticed demonstrating these courses over the last few years is when you have lots of people from very diverse backgrounds, so a chemist, a mathematician, a biologist, a physicist, someone who's been in industry for 3 years, it's almost impossible to actually pitch a short, intensive course at a level which both engages somebody who's never written a Python script before and also is in any way useful for a person with a CompSci degree. And in an environment where you don't necessarily have the resources or the physical space to actually offer multiple parallel courses, do you have any suggestions for how those courses can be structured such that everybody actually benefits and nobody
I'm not going to win with that
left out?
question. But
None of us are. That's why we're asking it.
But even if you think about, so Elixir has the test platform. Thank you, test folks. They're in the audience. Even if you think about how do we make it easier for a learner to identify herself, like literally like Lego blocks, that I guarantee you if you take course A, you're pretty much going to be ready to take course B. And whether that course B equivalent, well, there's one course B equivalent happening in this place or that place, or this one's entirely online. The idea of having training materials in a commons, so going into that metaphor, which I didn't expound upon here, but I think again, even if you were to say how many people in the world do any type of training in life sciences, it's not millions of people. So there has to be, as technology platforms like Slack or like GitHub and all those are giving us those tools, I think if we start just raising the idea of like, hey, you've got something that's 80% of the way there, you've got something that's 70%, if we can start that conversation and just have it in our heads that we need to combine those things and we need to do exactly what you're saying, what you said is a completely real problem, then maybe we have a chance of addressing it. So that's I think there's plenty of hope. I just don't know yet how we're going to do it. But my time, unfortunately, is over, so I have to. I was going to say a lot more, but
maybe talk later.
Great.
Thank you, Jason.